Before there was Injustice, there was Justice League Task Force. Well, there was also Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, but for the purposes of this video, nobody cares about that one. Released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, which we'll be looking at today, several years removed from the initial fighting game boom initiated by Capcom's own Street Fighter II, and less than a year after Capcom's initial superhero offering, X-Men Children of the Atom, laid the groundworks for the potential of a superhero fighting game. Justice League Task Force is a rather low-key fighting game that features little in superheroics, or anything remotely resembling a good fighting game, for that matter. Those coming into this expecting a dawn of justice will be rudely awakened with a dusk of mediocrity. That sounded stupid. The backstory behind Justice League Task Force is that members of the Justice League are going berserk. And by berserk, I mean they've all been replaced by robots, which is the main reason why members of the Justice League are beating the ever-loving poop out of each other. A cliche plot device, sure, but it works, and it makes sense in the context of why all the good guys are fighting each other. Your Justice League comprises several familiar superheroes, including Superman with his trademark mullet, Aquaman who also had a mullet, Green Arrow during his urban hunter phase, Wonder Woman back when people didn't give a shit about her costume, and finally Batman before he caught a throat infection that made him sound like ass. You see, kids? Even back in the day we had Batman vs. Superman. And that was underwhelming too. A yawn of justice indeed. Justice League Task Force features all the familiar trappings of a third-rate terrible fighting game that were all too common during the early to mid-1990s. Crummy controls, poor character balance, cheap AI, uninteresting characters, blander than bland gameplay. I guess we should break this down a bit. Control is the typical 6-button setup, 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons, so a 6-button controller is recommended. Each Justice League member, as well as the 3 supervillains on hand, has a variety of special moves that can be performed with your traditional Street Fighter-esque commands, quarter circles, half circles, charge moves. Charge moves are useless against the computer, by the way. They take too long to charge, and there's often a 50% chance that it'll execute. The same could be said for any of these moves actually. Even the easiest move like a fireball motion won't respond half the time, which means you're relegated to mashing buttons, which helps little in later bouts in higher difficulty settings. Meanwhile, your AI-controlled opposition can pull off special moves without a hitch, has sick response time, charge moves execute almost instantaneously, and is a generally cheap bastard. I don't get the balance here. You hit a guy with a move that knocks him down, but before he can hit the ground, you can hit him with another move and he's suddenly back on his feet. Dizzy spells are so infrequent in this game because it's possible to knock your opponent out of that state before the animation even starts. It gets to a point where rounds will occur where you can pound away at an opponent for several moves and his feet will only get off the ground when his health meter is in the red or you somehow managed a throw move, which is a simple punch in direction in close quarters. When that doesn't even work properly. Yeah. And then there's just the overall game itself. You're given 9 playable characters to choose from in the regular versus modes, but only the 6 Justice Leaguers are playable in the Hero mode, which is a central story mode that has you fighting clones of the Justice League, then D-list villains Despero and Cheetah, then your own clone, and finally you face off against Darkseid himself. The sad thing is that none of these characters are vaguely interesting or fun to play with. You'd figure Superman with his massive power set could do some pretty neat stuff, but no, he's just got a lame laser attack that's allegedly heat vision, a rather shitty freeze breath, and some aerial strikes. Batman just sorta twirls his cape a couple times, maybe toss a batarang, none of the really cool Batman stuff. Green Arrow has some gimmick arrows, but they're just the elemental types, nothing really crazy or outlandish. Even Darkseid comes off as something of a weenie with his lame fireball attacks and teleport tricks. It's unrealistic to believe that Acclaim, Sunsoft, Condor, whoever made this thing, it'd be unrealistic to believe that they'd be able to match the spectacle and intensity of Capcom's then new X-Men fighting game on 16-bit hardware. That expectation never crossed my mind because if Capcom couldn't do it, but you still could have done something with the property. I look at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters as an example of a Me Too fighting game done well that did some justice to the license. I look at the Power Rangers Fighting Edition game with the giant Megazords as another example of a Me Too fighting game done well and did justice to the source material. Hell, I'll even throw in the Power Ranger games on Game Gear, which are fantastic little fighting games that do the source material some semblance of justice. I look at Justice League Task Force and I see an utter waste of a license. This feels like a typically bad, generic Me Too fighting game that just has the Justice League license slapped on at the last minute. And the sad thing was the missed opportunity to tap into the potential of the idea. But then again, it is from Acclaim, but it's also from Sunsoft as well. So who to blame? Who to blame? Justice League Task Force sports adequate visuals, and that's about the sole point I'd make in that regard. The various fighters have some size and detail to them, they resemble who they're supposed to, but when it comes to animation, they're lacking in the frames, they look a bit choppy. Some of those moves look awkward as well. I like the overall presentation of this game. The cutscenes are lively and colorful even though they're primarily stock and similar. The various level layouts pop out with vibrant detail and are befitting of the characters that inhabit them, and even the opening shot with Darkseid is well done. If anything, the Genesis version of Justice League has far better overall presentation compared to the Super Nintendo version, which had different levels, and the presentation overall in that game felt a bit cheap. Cheaper than the computer AI, I imagine. Sound on the whole is mediocre all around. Sound effects are all stocky, echoey schlock that sounds like something out of a cheapo no-budget movie. Beyond the opening sequence, which features an appropriately ominous voiceover from Darkseid, what few voice bites are in the game are uninspired and totally forgettable. And then we get to the music, which is, I'm sorry, but it's lame. Again, the game opens with an exhilarating title theme that gets you pumped for action, and then the rest of the music hits, and it's dreadfully dull. I'd be hard-pressed to call it bad because it's not quite that, but it is rather forgettable fare. It's like they opened with an impressive introduction, and then they failed to live up to that initial first impression. When it comes to delivering superhero fisticuffs on the Sega Genesis, Justice League Task Force simply isn't up to the task. The fighting dwells somewhere within the realm of the mediocre and the mundane, the controls are not the most reliable, and the AI, for better or worse, is always going to be better than you no matter how hard you try to fool yourself. Expecting something along the lines of X-Men Children of the Atom, which came out around the same time, is foolhardy given the obvious hardware limitations. But even as just a straight-up fighting game without the context of being a superhero game, Justice League Task Force feels somewhat lacking and uninspired, no more different than all the other wannabe no-hit wonders that jumped on that particular Street Fighter II bandwagon. There is no justice to be found here in Justice League Task Force, only the mundane and the mediocre.